Okay, here's part 4 of World's Scariest Prisons. I really should start looking up, how to pronounce these before. Karandaroo Penitentiary. At its peak, Karandaroo Penitentiary was the largest prison on the South American continent. The vast complex in Sao Paulo, Brazil, opened in 1956, was built to house up to 4,000 people. Its population later grew to more than 8,000 inmates, doubling its intended capacity. The prisoners of Karandaroo were so terribly overcrowded that 10 men might be squeezed into a cell that was meant for 1 or 2. They were not permitted sunlight or fresh air. Behind the bars, also known as Encanto Candaroo or Candaroo Station, located in Sao Paulo, Brazil, operational 1956 to 2002, number of prisoners housed more than 8,000 inmates at its peak. Notable inmates during a large prison riot in 1992, 111 inmates were killed and another 87 were injured, and a movie was based on the event. Good Lord. Karandaroo's abuses and overcrowding created tension among prisoners that boiled over on October 2, 1992. Later reports described a fight between 2 prisoners that set off fighting between rival prison gangs. Police tried to get the rebellion under control, but the situation only worsened. Police were later accused of committing unjust violent acts against the rioting prisoners. 11 hours later, when the riot was finally over, more than 100 prisoners lay dead, but no officers had been killed. After the Karandaroo massacre, 25 police officers were sentenced to over 600 years in prison for their role in the riot. Then, more violence erupted in 2002. Inmates with cell phones coordinated riots at 27 jails across the country and held thousands of visitors hostage. Karandaroo was shut down shortly afterward, leaving behind a bloody history. Understanding prison gangs. Prison gangs are groups of prisoners who band together to support one another and sometimes commit criminal acts. Prison gangs can be a threat to prison peace because they are often violent and have been linked to the prison drug trade. Like gangs in non-prison life, prison gangs are often strictly organized with leaders, junior leaders, and upper and lower level members. Gangs often wear identifying items and use code words or gestures to distinguish them from other gangs. The Aryan Brotherhood, for instance, is a violent prison gang that supports racist beliefs and actions linked to white supremacy. The Barrio Azteca is a very large, mostly Mexican and Mexican-American prison gang known for smuggling drugs into prisons. Their symbols are BA and 21, among others. It's so weird to, think that this jail, got shut down in 2002. I always expect them to, the atrocities to not happen, in the time that you've been living. Robben Island. We serve with pride reads a sign over the entrance to the Robben Island prison, but the political prisoners held in this isolated rocky island off the coast of South Africa likely disagreed. Robben Island has served several purposes over the years as a leper colony and a military outpost. But during South Africa's era of apartheid, 1948 to 1996, it served as a prison for activists who opposed the government's racial discrimination policies. Behind the Bars, also known as the Island, located in Cape Town, South Africa, operational 1961 to 1991. Number of prisoners, more than 3,000 political activists while Robben Island functioned as a prison. Notable inmates, Nelson Mandela, Nobel laureate, former president of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, current president of South Africa. Life in prison. Many prisoners were held for years, some for decades. Conditions on the island were infamously harsh. Prisoners were kept in tiny cells and fed only porridge. Beatings and other brutal treatment by the guards were common. The most famous prisoner of Robben Island was Nelson Mandela, the revolutionary activist, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and former president of South Africa. Mandela worked to end the racist segregation practices of the apartheid government. He was arrested and accused of trying to overthrow the government in 1962. He was sent to Robben Island, where he was imprisoned from 1964 until 1982. All alone, Mandela was allowed only one visitor a year who could stay for only 30 minutes. He was allowed to send one letter every 6 months. For the prisoners, the isolation was almost as painful as the living conditions. One of the only times inmates could communicate with one another was when emptying and cleaning their chamber pots in the mornings. In his autobiography, Mandela describes how the prisoners would try to whisper to one another in the evenings before they went to sleep. To do so, they would throw handfuls of sand on the floor outside their cells so they could hear the footsteps of the guards approaching. Secret communication. In later years, conditions slightly improved. The prisoners were occasionally allowed to play tennis and other activities. Still, they had little time to communicate with one another. Sometimes they would cut open the tennis balls to slip notes inside and pass to a fellow prisoner. What is a political prisoner? Mahatma Gandhi, Leon Trotsky, Nelson Mandela, Eugene Debs, Aung San Suu Kyi. These very different people have one thing in common. Each was held as a political prisoner. A political prisoner is different from a criminal prisoner. A criminal goes to prison after being convicted of a specific crime, murder, for instance, or fraud. A political prisoner is jailed for words and actions that challenge the government or its policies. For example, political activists may be imprisoned if they try to overturn a government. The great Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi was arrested and jailed many times in India, where he was working to free India from British rule. The British government thought Gandhi was dangerous because he encouraged Indian people to stand up for independence from colonial British rule. Public gall. Several centuries ago, jails were often simple wood sheds that were meant to hold people only for a short time, and from which prisoners could easily escape. But the public gaol is an early spelling of jail, in Williamsburg, Virginia, was one of the first secure jails in colonial America. In the early 1700s, officials in Virginia's capital city ordered the construction of a substantial brick prison. Behind the bars, also known as the gaol, located in colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, operational 1704 to 1910, number of prisoners, countless runaway slaves, pirates, debtors, and mentally ill prisoners during its 200 years. Notable inmates, 15 henchmen of the pirate Blackbeard, Henry Hare Byer Hamilton, Lieutenant Governor of British Detroit. Who were the inmates? When the jail was complete, debtors were locked away with runaway slaves and the mentally ill. Side note, I really hate reading about places that just locked up the mentally ill like that. They deserve help, not being in jail. During the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, political prisoners such as supporters of the British spies and traitors were locked in the public gaol. In 1718, there were even some men who worked for the private captain Blackbeard. Conditions were crowded and unsanitary. Jail fever, otherwise known as typhus, broke out often. There was no heat in the frigid Virginia River, and most prisoners were chained at the hands and feet. The public gaol was in use for the next 200 years until 1910, when it was closed. It was later reopened in 1936 as part of historic colonial Williamsburg. Prison ships. Gaols on land weren't the only notorious prisons of the late 18th century. During the American Revolution, there were empty buildings to house prisoners, so the British began keeping American prisoners of war in empty ships. Before long, 16 prison ships were filled with American revolutionaries captured in battle. The conditions on the prison ships were particularly bad, even for the standards of the day. Prisoners were fed barely enough to keep them alive. Dead and dying prisoners were jammed together with healthy prisoners. Disease was everywhere. Depending on the season, prisoners spent sweltering or freezing days up on the deck and brutal nights in the crowded lower levels of the ship. An American officer recalls being forced to sleep on cow dung without blankets or bedding, and being made to drink bilge water, the filthy water that collects in the bottom of the ship. The suffering by American prisoners on Revolutionary-era prison ships was so extreme that a monument to them was erected in Brooklyn. The prison ship Martyrs Monument, a towering column, stands in Fort Greene Park, and the remains of 11,500 men and women who died on the ships rest in a grave beneath it. Good Lord. That's a lot of people. Livingston's Sugar House. A sugar house seems an odd place for a prison, but Livingston's Sugar House was a real jail built in the 1770s in New York City. During this period, a sugar house was a warehouse for sugar and molasses that had been imported from the West Indies. These large, sturdy buildings were often taken over for use as prisons. But like so many prisons, Livingston's Sugar House was incredibly overcrowded. 400 to 500 prisoners were kept there, often in terrible living conditions. The prisoners were kept in near starvation. One former prisoner wrote about his time in Sugar House. A board fence encircled the dark, gloomy building, and windows were set high on the walls. Located behind the bars, located in Manhattan, New York. Operational 1754 to 1846. Number of prisoners 400 to 500 inmates at a time. Notable inmates, Revolutionary War prisoners, were held here, including Judge John Thomas and Commodore Silas Talbot, one of the first American naval commanders. I think it's so crazy that, like, people can be locked up. And it's been proven that, like, this doesn't work. Like, prisoners need to be treated like people, too. Hungry inmates. Inside the walls were emancipated starving men. They ate small amounts of pork and sea biscuits. The biscuits were so moldy and wormy that prisoners had to boil them in water so the worms would float to the top. When they had fuel, inmates would also cook meat this way, but no fuel was available, they would eat it raw. Stories were told of men who were so hungry they tried to eat their own clothes and shoes. Prison food. For most of history, prison food has been famously bad. In the United States and Europe, moldy stale bread and poorly cooked meat were ordinary prison fare. The fresh fruits and vegetables were too valuable to be wasted on prisoners. But often throughout history, those who were wealthy and imprisoned could pay to receive better food, even wine to drink. Today, prison food has been compared to medium-quality cafeteria food. In the United States, by law, prisoners cannot be starved or deprived of nutrients as punishment. The food doesn't have to taste good, but there must be enough for it to be healthy, and it must be edible. Prisoners are sometimes punished by being given a Nutriloaf in place of their usual food, a blend of vegetables and potatoes mixed with dairy and processed chicken, shaped into a loaf and baked. Not all prison food is bad. A menu from Alcatraz from the 1940s offers roast pork shoulder, chili, potato chowder, codfish, and apricot pie.